Hi, and welcome back to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the authors that bring them to you. And here we are doing a special release for a collection that I'm in as well that we've been trying to make happen for a while. It is Faerie Films, We Folk on the Big Screen. So before we dive in too much, I want everybody to introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk about the different essays, the pieces in the project, and we're going to have more fun. And Josh, I'm going to put you up first since you were the one that got roped in to be the editor for this.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. My name is Joshua Cutchin. I am an author of what I tell people on airplanes is speculative nonfiction. And then if they really press me, I tell them that I write about UFOs and Bigfoot and things like that. I have a couple of different books to my name, and I've always been seeking new sort of, I guess modalities is sort of a pretentious way of saying it, but new scenarios that I haven't done before. So I've written several solo books. I've written with a co-author. And about 3 years ago, I had the idea of putting together a book of essays with contributors. And that is the project that eventually became, after quite a bit of adversity, Faerie Films. So I'm a contributor, and I'm also the editor of all the essays.
Wren?
Hi, everyone. I'm Wren Collier. I am a writer, magician, and alchemist living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've known Josh for quite some time. One of the entire reasons I started writing this kind of stuff was because of correspondences with Josh back in, like 2012,
Something like that,
2014 or something, a long time ago. But yeah, no, Josh asked me if I wanted to be a part of this and gave me a chance to talk about one of my favorite sort of semi-obscure films. So I jumped at the offer. It was a lot of fun.
Susan?
Hi, I'm Susan Demeter. I'm an author, artist, and a magical practitioner. I like to refer to myself as a witch. My first solo book, Cosmic Witch, really deals with my own experiences with spirit, witchcraft, witchcraft in general, and UFOs, which is an interesting combination. And I was just so excited. I've done a few projects with Joshua, including Ufology Tarot that's about to come out. And I was just really, really excited to be a part of this project because everything fairy. Yeah, and films. So that's me.
Patrick?
Hey, I'm Patrick Dugan. I am a science fiction fantasy author of 8 books. My newest one is Never Steal from Dragons, which also has fairies in it, so it was a really good tie-in. I'm also the acquiring editor for Educated Dragon, which produced Faerie Films after a long hiatus.
Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Jornlin. I'm glad to be here today. I am a writer, researcher for American Ghost Walks, and that's how I spend my days, is doing pretty heavy historical research on different destinations and then finding the best and scariest ghost stories and writing and recounting those stories to the best of my ability so that our tour guides around the country can deliver the best and scariest haunted history tours. And so I wrote an essay about scary fairies, which are my favorite because they are just so unknown. And so I talked a lot about real incidences of unexplained deaths and illnesses. And I'm really excited to be in this book with all of you, and excited to work with Joshua because I've been a big fan of his books for a really long time.
And Mark?
Hi, my name's Mark Anthony Wyatt. I've been involved in the paranormal for many, many years, and
Mark froze up. The fairies got him.
I was like, and?
times I've...
Hey, Mark.
Sorry.
Mark, we lost you just as you got started. So.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yep. So if you just kind of want to restart it, then we'll edit it and cut.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, my name's Mark Anthony Wyatt. I'm a researcher, writer, sort of amateur musician, I suppose. I like to restore old houses. Like everyone else here, I do dozens of things really. I've always been involved in the sort of high strangeness angle for many years, and something of an experiencer in the past as well, mostly in the past. But just recently, I've sort of crossed over more into. I sort of still do the high strangeness, but I've got more interested in the sort of cultural side, the arts, and how that relates to the paranormal. So this is what I'm actually sort of getting stuck into right now, actually, in recent times. And I run a podcast called the Cuckoo Town Podcast, which covers a bit of both, really. I was approached by Josh to, put an essay in on something, and I made the decision to do something on Twin Peaks because I'd enjoyed it when I was younger, much younger, when it first came out, and I thought it was time to rewatch the whole thing and dig into it. And in retrospect, that was a really tough call to do because it's a lot longer than I think most people have probably done a film, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours max. I did 3 series and I bit off more than I could chew, but I think it worked out pretty well in the end. I hope so. But I'm very, very proud of the fact that Josh actually considered me, good enough to be part of this project. So thanks, Josh. I appreciate it.
Josh. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Mark.
No, you're welcome. And I'm just hearing everybody talk. I just can't stop smiling because I realize how much I like all of you. So it's good to be here.
So, Josh, do you want to dive a little bit more into kind of the history of the project and how this thing came together and why you thought this was a good idea at the time before you poked the bear?
Well, I've had an idea for a couple of years. I guess it's been a couple of years since I embarked on this project, so several years. Of looking at just the influence that fairy folklore continues to exert upon our culture, at least in the English-speaking language. I'm sure other languages have their own influences to sort of tally up. But there were always these things that I would notice that are still with us, even though the idea of fairies is kind of a go-to response when you want to deride someone, right? Oh, you believe in UFOs and Bigfoot. Do you believe in leprechauns and unicorns? That's sort of the go-to thing that people will say. Even at the same time, when they'll use words like, stroke or cobalt, or all these different terms that are still with us that are direct imports, and sometimes direct imports, sometimes at the very least strongly associated with fairy folklore. So that always struck me as really incongruous, and I always thought it would be interesting to sort of see how that influence plays itself out. I played with the idea of like a coffee table book that was just like going through different words and things, but I ended up deciding that it would be interesting to sort of pull people into taking a look at how fairy folklore continues to exert itself in film, because once you have enough of a knowledge of these things, you start seeing how, some of these terms and some of these motifs continue to sort of bubble up, even in contexts where you wouldn't expect them to. So, there's obvious scenarios where, there are fairies on screen. So, of course, you're going to see fairy folklore. But, some of the essays in this book detail films where there is no explicit mention of fairies at all. But still, these ideas keep on coming back around. So that was the original idea. I think it's probably a pretty even split between people who decided to take films that are explicitly fairy films and take a look at the influence of fairy folklore on those films. And my original reason for not doing that was, number one, it was going to be a little bit overt to say, oh, this film is influenced by fairy folklore. And I'm like, well, yeah, no duh, it has fairies in it. But what I found really interesting is that for all of the changes that are sort of ahistorical, for lack of a better term, that you see in modern fairy belief that have come out of cinema and urban fantasy and things like that, there are still these bits that persevere in the face of, dare I say, fairy misinformation. So that's an interesting way to look at it. And then the original mandate of this project to look at films that have nothing to do with fairies through the lens of fairy folklore is still in there as well. I mean, I myself wrote an essay on a film. Let's get this mixed up. It's a Dutch film called Borgman, which was sort of an Oscar darling for a while, and it got a lot of grief when it was first released because people were like, "Oh, this film is nonsensical. It doesn't have any internal logic." People didn't know how to approach it. You know, is it an environmental parable? Is it a class parable? Are the antagonists demons and this sort of thing and that sort of thing? And I have to admit, when I first saw it, I mean, it's a 2013 film, so when I first saw it, I wasn't as deeply invested in this folklore as I am now. When I first saw it, I sort of fell into that camp as well. I was like, oh, it's kind of got some interesting imagery, but it doesn't really make any sense. And then there was some kind soul, and can't remember who it was, and I have looked and I haven't been able to find who it was, but there was some kind soul who said, Josh, you should look at this through the lens of fairy folklore. And I said, okay, and it just sort of sat on that idea for a while. And I revisited the film, and it was shocking how much sense it made when you looked at it with that in mind, looking at sort of the primary, I guess, antagonist of Borgman, the titular antagonist, as a fairy. And it renders all the nonsensical bits that seem like they're just, artistic frou-frou. It really renders those into something that is coherent in a way that I found absolutely shocking. So to that end, some of the people who contributed essays that we don't have here today, because I don't want to step on anybody's toes about talking about their own essays, wrote about other films such as Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I made it a point to say somebody's got to do CE3K. So they wrote about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Trying to think of who else we don't have here. Well, I could bring up the files, but I won't bother right now. But Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we had some people. Oh, that's right. So we had Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Dark Crystal, and Labyrinth get talked about. So those are a little bit more explicitly in the folklore, the fairy realm. And also, Simon Young wrote about sort of the prevalence of theosophic fairies, that sort of nature elemental concept of fairies, and tracing it through Disney, and sort of, I think, does a great job of rescuing the validity of that interpretation in Walt Disney's work, because that's the thing that we always go to when we're deep into fairy lore. We're like, they're not Disney fairies, but Simon says no, there's a reason to appreciate the Disney fairies. So that's probably an overshared explanation of the genesis of the project, but that's it in a nutshell.
Well, I'll dive in. I'll actually start with my essay because it's one of those that was probably not in because when I sent it to Josh and he said, hey, can you send me something? And I was like, great. I sent a list of proposals, and the top one on the list was the 1984 version of Dune. And he said, there's no way you're going to turn that into fairy folklore.
Yeah, yep.
He says, I just got to see it. There's no way. And I basically wrote it up. I mean, because again, here's the cheating part of it. I write science fiction, fantasy, horror. I also have written a lot of stuff in nonfiction, magics, religions, anthropological studies, all kinds of stuff. So I'm like, absolutely it is. It's just a different representation of the same kind of lore. We have, the sandworms or sand dragons. But what was really more fun was exploring things like the Bene Gesserit and some of the things that we saw that explicitly tie to things like the fairy blast and other things out of fairy lore. So doing my essay was a tremendous amount of fun. I did the first draft, and I hadn't watched Dune in years. Hadn't watched it, hadn't read it, hadn't pulled it out in years. And then I did a first draft. I said, I probably ought to go back and rewatch the movie. And I didn't edit it too much. I did a fair amount of, I did a little bit of rewrite and added a few things. But looking at the idea, and I think that's part of the idea of the universality of the folklore, is how imbued it becomes in everything if you watch something through that particular filter, especially thing where there's that element of tricksterism, or there are elements of things aren't what they seem. And so I think that was a fun experiment. So Wren, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your essay and piece in this one. And you're on mute.
Yeah, so the essay I wrote is about a semi-obscure direct-to-video Japanese horror movie called Maribito by Takashi Shimizu. If you ever haunted Blockbuster videos in the mid-90s, you probably saw this movie in the Asian horror area. That's where I first saw it. I think I watched it in high school, and it always stuck with me because at the time, when I was in high school, I was very into Lovecraftian fiction, and Maribito is very heavily informed by Lovecraft. And in particular, I didn't realize this until after I actually wrote the essay, but the writer of the film is Chiaki J. Kanaka, who people might be familiar with if they've seen Serial Experiments Lane or Digimon Tamers. He's a kind of infamous and sort of controversial writer of anime and film, and he wrote this movie, which now that I've been kind of going through his different projects, some of the stuff in this movie makes even more sense to me, like an obsession with primitive humanity. But the idea of Moribito is that it's a movie about what the Greeks called katabasis, or a trip and return from the underworld. It's something that another thing I was fascinated with since I was a kid, Greek mythology. It's this idea that in the underground there is knowledge to be found if you can successfully go there and bring it back and integrate it. One of the most famous versions of that is the story of Orpheus. And what you'll find in most stories of katabasis is that they're failed katabasis. Orpheus fails his katabasis. He fails to bring back Eurydice, and at the end of his life is torn apart. I mean, but he did bring back wisdom, which is where you get sort of the Orphic tradition, the Orphic sort of mystery cult tradition from. As far as how this ties into Farie folklore, in both sort of Scandinavian and German folklore, and in folklores around the world, fairies are often depicted as living underground. Even in American indigenous folklore, you have stories of sort of little people who live underground, who have magical abilities and can teach you things, but are also sort of dangerous. And the whole word Maribito itself refers to, like, it can refer to any sort of spirit or entity, but particularly it means a spirit who comes from afar but has like wisdom to teach you, even if they are outwardly frightening. And similarly, in the movie, the main character finds this whole sort of underground world underneath modern Tokyo, and ends up finding a girl inside of what he calls like the Mountains of Madness, like this giant sort of almost like Hollow Earth cave in there. And the main character's like sort of obsession throughout the movie is understanding like what true horror is, like what true terror is. Like he's constantly fascinated by things like snuff films, and he's constantly like filming everything around him. And through this Maribito, through this like spirit that he brings out of the underground, he's finally able to understand true terror and completes his katabasis. But it ends up being a failed attempt because he, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, cuts out his like own tongue and like is unable to speak and unable to communicate any of these revelations that he's had, and ends up being trapped in the underworld. And in my essay, I like sort of tied that into the idea in Thelema and Aleister Crowley's philosophy of like crossing the abyss. This idea that at some point in order for the magician to become a magus, they have to cross an area which is, psychological in nature, but of like infinite darkness, in which they have their own personal demon to overcome. And if the magician is unable to do this, they are sort of forever trapped in the abyss. So it's like a perilous journey. I just thought it was fascinating that the movie had all these elements from both the occult and from folklore. Like blood is a constant theme in it, which comes up again and again in fairy lore. And in general, the whole movie, and this is something that pops up a lot in Chiaki J. Kanaka's writing and work, is taking Western folklore and pop culture references and putting them into like an almost Japanese folkloric context, like creating a synthesis of the two, which is something I like find really, really interesting.
Susan, how about you and your piece?
Oh, yeah. It was a bit of a synchronicity, because the film I chose, I had watched, I think, about a month or two before Josh contacted me. It's a fairly recent film from 2019 called The Hole in the Ground. And I really loved it because I was looking at it like through that fairy faith, that fairy folklore lens right away. And I was a bit surprised, because I was doing that when I looked at some of the reviews for this film, that there were certain people that were giving it lower reviews because I guess they just didn't get it. Like Josh mentioned, because the film doesn't directly deal with calling these beings fairies, or in the case of one of the characters, a changeling. People are wondering, like, are they demons? What's going on here? So basically, the film, which is a nice little indie folk horror coming out of Ireland. It was filmed in Ireland. It deals with a single mom, a newly single mom, and her son. And they move from the city to this very liminal country house in rural Ireland on the edge of a forest. And that's why I say the placement is rather liminal. And at the beginning, they seem like, they're renovating this house and things are looking better for them. And they're in this nice small village, until one night when her son supposedly leaves the house. He goes out into this forest. And when mom realizes her son is missing, she goes out and she encounters this very large crater-like hole in this forest. And then finds her son and brings him back home. And at that point, you start slowly seeing these changes within her son that definitely fit that folklore, definitely Irish, but also across Europe, of these children and adults as well that have been changed with the fairies. And they begin becoming by more sinister, doing things that are very much out of character. Like, for instance, she notices all of a sudden her son really loves this spaghetti bolognese, which before he would have nothing to do with. And this child is like eating and changing his habits, becoming more sinister, becoming more dark. And this is how the story progresses. Until she finds a neighbor who had a son who had passed away, and she herself was struggling with mental challenges because of this, and the fact that she connected her son's disappearance with this hole in the ground. So again, you're dealing with all these different folkloric motifs, but if you don't watch the film through those lenses, you can become lost. But it really is an interesting film. And I started to do a deeper dive into it after I began the essay. And I was finding all sorts of little synchronicities that as well, I thought, I wonder if the filmmaker was actually aware of them. For instance, the lead character, she's Sarah O'Neill. And the O'Neill family, the actual O'Neill family from Ireland, do have a banshee associated with them that was created out of a changeling situation where there was something done in bad faith with the fairies. One of the daughters is taken away and she's taken to the other world, and she is allowed to come back and let them know she's in the other world, but she has to maintain and stay there. And then after that, this banshee comes about, and I forget the name of the actual castle this is associated with, but it is the O'Neill family. So doing the deeper dive into the film, I started finding all these little synchronicities and other interesting little aspects. It also has a bit of an Alice in Wonderland kind of theme going as well. You have mirrors, another folklore motif. To me, it's just like the idea of exploring the other world. But this film is horror. It's not what you would expect of fairies. So I understand why maybe some people would get confused as to why you would think that this is a fairy film, but definitely through those lenses, you can see it. And it is quite scary. These beings are relentless, and they do not like humans. They don't. They're, better to leave them be. So that's where I'm at with my essay. And I hope people go out and enjoy the film, because like I said, it really deserved more, I think, than it was given critically.
Patrick?
So I was the last person to get picked up for the project. So Josh was like, I need an essay. And I am a science fiction and fantasy writer. So this was outside my comfort zone. So I sent him a list of films, and top on my list was Rocky Horror Picture Show.
And I love how like left field, the better. It's great.
Yeah, I'm the outlier with that. Mine is it delves into all the fairy lore, but it is very snarky in its tone, because that's what I write. So it is the dessert of the book. It was such a fun story. I was like, because I had other more serious films, I was like, Josh was like, no, I really need this story. So, and then I wrote the first page and said, he better check this, because it is not academic in tone or, and
if I can interject, Patrick, please. I mean, it's the book still has sort of, I mean, I'm sure that there's some people who are going to say that it's quite shaggy in terms of the tone that's all over it, but I kind of find that part of its charm. Like, there are some things that are, completely academic, and there are some things that are a little bit more conversational. And I don't think that's necessarily an indicator in terms of the value of any of them, because I think that it speaks to the fact that this folklore comes to you wherever you are, and sometimes you might not even consciously realize it, but it's also here. So having the voice of people who aren't like, eyeballs deep in folklore, I think was really important. So just saying that, you did great.
No, thanks. It was a lot of fun to write. Although it took probably a good year before I could watch Rocky Horror Picture Show again. And then I got to meet Barry Bostwick and told him about the book, and he's like, I want a copy. I'm like, well, yeah, we'll get there sooner or later. And we did.
Allison, how about you?
Okay, so my essay is called Scary Fairies, Boogeymen of Yore. And what I envisioned is, I love film, but I also love the real aspects of fairies. So mine was more wide-ranging, where I didn't choose just one movie, but I looked at a plethora of movies and TV shows and talked about the elements that connect with the fairy folklore. Much like Joshua was saying earlier, the words that come down to us from fairy folklore and are still in use like every day, and people don't realize the connection. I mean, that fascinated me. So I looked for motifs, throughout TV and movies, and I found a lot of scary elements. I also found that there might be some vestiges of the experience with fairies that also are coming out in people's behaviors today, like, for instance, the uncanny valley response that sometimes people have to objects like dolls, for instance, or now we're in the era of AI, and we're going to see a lot of scary things going forward in reality. I connected the uncanny valley experience with possibly interactions with the unknown, i.e. fairies, and think that some of our behaviors evolutionarily may have come from those interactions with fairies, and we still see elements coming out in human culture today. And to me, the whole subject of fairies has always been fascinating because of the cross-cultural element. I can't, besides ghosts, there's not another phenomena that really does that so completely, in my opinion. For you to find, in Ireland, all these traditions, and then find very similar traditions in Native America, for example. I mean, that was very eye-opening to me to see how many commonalities there are. And I think there's something real to fairies. And so, although I love film, I tried to connect these scarier elements in a variety of programs with the scarier elements in real lore, and also news of unexplained death and illness.
And Mark, how about you?
Hi, yes. Excuse me. I've tweaked the title a few times over the last few years trying to get this together.
Yeah.
So to be honest, I'm looking at the old copy here, and I was desperately trying to find the new version. But basically, my title was "More Wind, Please: A Look at the Magic, Myth, and Mystery of Twin Peaks," with an emphasis on the folklore of the forest. But I think I sort of condensed that a bit into something a bit sharper. But that's the whole thing about Twin Peaks. Is, I mean, when I first mentioned to a few people outside of these sort of circles that I was going to write an essay on Twin Peaks and the connection to fairy lore and so on, I got a few sort of strange looks, and people, highly intelligent people, laughed and said, "Well, it's a soap opera, isn't it? It's some glossy American soap opera." Well, no, it's 100% not really. I mean, it's got elements of soap opera in it, obviously, but I'm quite a methodical person, and I just sat down and watched every episode and sat there with an A4 pad and just basically jotted down everything of interest, and all these themes that I didn't know were there just kept jumping out at me. And I have to give credit actually to Janice, my lady, because she spotted that in the opening credits of Twin Peaks. I mean, I can't possibly do credit to what I wrote, really, because in a few minutes talking, I can't cover it. None of us can, really. But she picked out the opening credits of Twin Peaks are like a ritual in themselves. And if you'll have to read the essay to understand that, but everything, the fire, the air, the water, everything, it's all there. And I watched it over and over, and yes, it is definitely there. Now, whether Frost and Lynch put it there deliberately, I mean, somebody else was saying this earlier about how you can do things without even knowing you're doing them. I don't know if it was deliberate or not, because nobody else, I've listened to people talking about Twin Peaks constantly over the last few years. Nobody else ever mentions it. So whether that's just wishful thinking on my part.
This is if I can interject, this is where I often butt heads with the synchronistics, because to me sometimes it's more interesting if it isn't deliberate. It's almost more magical if it isn't deliberate.
Yeah.
So yeah, as opposed to like, there's this secret language of symbolism among the elites. I'm like, well, or these archetypes are that powerful that they just well up.
They work through us. Yeah. True.
I mean, not to interject myself, but if with as much Kenneth Grant like references there are in Mark Frost's like writing in Twin Peaks, I would say that a lot of it probably is pretty deliberate.
Well, and even because of pulling in the David Lynch influences off of my take on Dune, I think that you see probably a lot of crossover in some of the same themes as you do with Twin Peaks. Not to mention the fact of having some of the same actors, having a lot of the same elements crossing over between the two. And of course, I hadn't seen your essay at the time that I was doing my piece on it, but there's definitely a lot of interesting, consistent elements between the two.
Sorry, I didn't mean to completely break the seal on your pitch there, Mark. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It actually helps. I mean, I will just say a few other things that it actually opened up a few doors for me, literally, like in my mind, if nothing else. It got me interested in going back to the old folklore. What am I saying? My mind's going. I used to read a lot of Algan and Blackwood and Arthur Mack, and I still do. I've come back to it now. But a lot of their stories are just very, very wrapped up in the whole Twin Peaks sort of idea. I mean, the actual... David Lynch himself, he used to say to the actors, "I want more wind, please." And what he meant by that was he wanted more mystery. And it's all there. And there's so many similarities between these old sort of Algan and Blackwood stories with the fairy lore. It's all there. And you hear people, when you listen to paranormal podcasts, you hear people discussing situations, where people get lost in the woods in a place which they know so well, and they've been in it hundreds of times, like a guy going to his, his shooting, what do they call them, up in the trees. And he'd been there every morning for like the last 10 years and returned from it, and he got lost, Well, this sort of thing is all in these old so-called fictional books. But that sort of brings to mind, does the fiction feed, is there like a cycle there? And they're sort of feeding each other, the fiction and the fact, if you like, or the alleged fact. So anyway, and it also took me into areas like the old sort of Germanic sort of forestry, sort of pagan folklore. That's all in Twin Peaks. I mean, everything, and the Greek stuff. There's just everything's in it. And in a way, my only regret was I would prefer Twin Peaks to have stopped at the end of the second series, probably. I struggled with the final one, and and if you go back to the original, when I first watched Twin Peaks back in the very, very early 90s, I didn't see it through the same prism that I'm seeing it now. It was more. I enjoyed the humor. I loved the quirkiness of it, and the young ladies were all attractive. It was more of a soap. But in looking at it again now as an adult, or an alleged adult, it's just I see it through totally different eyes now, and it's fascinating. And I just hope that people enjoy all the research that went into it. That's all I'll say for now.
And welcome, Jack. Do you want to introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about your essay piece?
Sure. Hello. Nice to be here. I'm Dr. Jack Hunter. I'm an anthropologist, and I write about the paranormal and things like that. And my chapter in the book is that it's all about sort of a feedback loop between culture and experience, really. And I start off talking about my own fairy experiences, and then reflecting on how they might have been influenced in some ways by my consumption of films like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and especially the artwork of Brian Froud and the book Fairies. So yeah, it's a chapter all about that, and it's not to suggest that because the experiences were influenced by cultural things that necessarily means that they were fake or anything like that, but it suggests a much more kind of dynamic relationship between our perceptions and experiences and the cultural kind of context that we grow up in. And I was very lucky to have access to, for writing the chapter, some interviews with Brian Froud, where he talks about his own experience initially of creating these fairies, obviously, drawing on artistic inspiration and fairy artists from the past. But, essentially he was making up these images, and then people would come to him and say, how did you know that that's what a fairy looks like? And I see things that look like that all the time.
If I could interject,
Yeah.
Jack, great to have you here. If I recall correctly, and this may have since changed in the 3 years since we all did these essays, but that interview was at the time unpublished. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, it's still unpublished.
Okay, so yeah, it's a new Brian Froud interview for everyone out there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to sort of say too is there was part of that he talks about, but if I recall correctly, isn't the similarity between his work and John Bauer's work addressed in your essay as well?
Yeah, that's definitely talked about a little bit. Yeah.
And I love his reaction to that.
Yeah. It's really cool. It's a great interview, and it's quite revealing about interesting things. Mm-hmm. He talks about how eventually he started to have his own experiences with fairies. So, it's again this idea that it starts off as an artistic, creative endeavor, but it kind of comes full circle back around and becomes an experiential phenomenon. So that's what it's all about, really, my chapter.
So looking at, kind of all the stories and just the essays that are packed into this book, there's a great deal of experience. There's a great deal of how we look at life through the perspective of film, and how we look at the perspective of film through our own experiences. Last weekend I was on a panel at JordanCon where we were talking about the power of myth and the power of it and the importance of it within culture. And we were having a long conversation about this. And I just kind of want to throw this out there for an open question. And when we look at how we tell story, how we relate experience, how we use this idea of the power of myth to pass on lessons, to pass on the idea. Sometimes it is, don't go out in the woods because we don't want you to get lost, but fairy could be out there. Or sometimes the experiences that happen we don't have better language for. From having done your piece for the book, and just sort of maybe even how it's changed your view on media and how it's changed your view on reading and watching film, watching TV, and watching life around you, has actually having to focus on the idea of storytelling through that lens of fairy changed how you look at things? So I'll throw that out there kind of as an open question.
Well, I'll jump in right quick. I've been viewing things through the fairy lens for a while, so it didn't really change that. But I do realize that the timing of this release for me is quite telling. I don't think it was out yet because it wasn't time for it to be out yet, and that's sort of very Charles Fort. It was steam engine time, right? If anybody gets that reference. But what I mean by that is, this is a book that's dealing with primarily fiction. I think probably majority of the people who are involved believe that there's some sort of objective reality to the fairy phenomenon, but it really does highlight this sort of phase that I somehow stumbled into right now, where I am more interested in fiction. And for the longest time, I wasn't interested in fiction. I mean, yes, I would consume it, but I was sort of more interested in the quote unquote real experiences that people were having. And I still, obviously have a great deal of interest in that, but I've shifted a little bit more towards realizing fiction, or rather appreciating fiction as a genuine interface with the other. And it's kind of funny. The last thing of mine that was published was an essay in Dr. Hunter's excellent essay collection called Deep Weird on High Strangeness. And my essay deals at what we can learn from cinematic techniques when we're looking at high strangeness. And today I just finished a novel yesterday. So obviously fiction is sort of in my, thank you. Fiction is sort of in my wheelhouse now, and I realize how many important things it has to say. And I'm not convinced this might be a little bit out there for some of the panelists and some of the contributors, but I do think that fiction is a legitimate vector of interfacing with whatever this other intelligence is. And I do think that some of these things, some of our fictions, are directly guided by something beyond the human.
Yeah, and let me actually add this in there, because when we use the term myth, we always take that perception that myth means that it's not real. Whereas my perception on the concept of the word myth is more a matter of it's the story we tell to understand the experience. It's the lens we put everything through. And this was a large part of the conversation last weekend, was about how do we define myth? What's the importance of it? Because again, it's everyone's experience is radically different. Even if you take a pair of twins that are next to each other that have lived largely the same points of life, there are still radical differences in the two in experience.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah, well, you hatched a couple. I mean, so so that it's this idea of modern storytelling is continuing the legacy of telling myth. And it's the way we frame up common experience. It's the way we frame up those things that are important, because some of them are experiences on how we live life. Some of them are ways to shape our common culture. And I think one of the things that was also really important out of this is that we saw global fairy myth come out, where we saw consistent themes regardless of culture. And I think that's part of the importance of the different takes on the myth and how we perceive things through our own cultural lens. And I wanted to kind of throw that out there as well.
Yeah, Josh, like a drum that I've been banging on for a little while now is from a practical standpoint, these like entities that we engage with, spirits, fairies, whatever. This idea that I've had lately that they are literally made of stories, like they're made of myth, right? Like that is the like superstructure upon which they gain ingress into our world, right? Like without the stories, they're nothing. Even to the point where I've realized this isn't a new idea. I've been doing a reread of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and part of the structure of any like ceremonial magic operation is storytelling. Like the Lunar Mansion operation I did last night, part of it is this long oration about the moon, talking about like the moon's different names, the moon's story, like the things that are associated with the moon, like going through that sort of mythological framework. And even like the Orphic hymns are basically that for each planet and different Greek goddesses and gods and stuff. It's like part of ritual is storytelling. And as far as the like sort of the first point you made about how this can be viewed through like a cultural lens, I find fascinating that given the universality of fairy lore around the world through all cultures and through all civilizations, that it exists as sort of this like rhizomatic substrata that informs basically all fiction and myth, right? Like it puts its mycelium out into literally every story we tell at some point goes back to these myths and legends. And I find that like fascinating because it's underpinning everything.
I'm going to just jump in and say I totally agree with you. And part of my chapter for Dr. Jack Hunter's book is about a conjuring model of the deep weird. and how we can use fictional storytelling and myth making to explore these subjects and perhaps experience them for ourselves. Because as magical practitioners, it becomes clear the importance of myth and fiction. And I think too about Whitley Strieber, and in the book that he did with Dr. Jeff Kripal, how he advocates for a need for better fiction when having these experiences, because he relates a lot of his own personal experiences to the pop culture of the time, the 1950s, and that the alien kind of sci-fi that was out there, as to influencing his experiences much later on in life. So I like that idea, but I definitely feel that myth is and our stories and what we're putting out there, it goes out there, and then the experiences are somewhat coming from inside ourselves, and then they express themselves in the outer world. So I totally 100% get you. I think we're on the same page.
Anybody else have anything they want to throw in?
I mean, yeah, to sort of, because I have to leave here in a little bit for the gigs. But I think to sort of piggyback off of what Susan's saying, it's almost like the paranormal experience is where the metaphorical truth of myth intersects with the literal truth of one's life. And there might be a tiny point of elision between those two. And that's something that I found interesting, that I found when, again, not turning this to a discussion of what I just completed the other day, but in writing fiction, I always parroted like a good little Jungian influenced Fortean. I was always like, people don't have ideas have people. And it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to experience that. And I know, both you and Patrick, who have written fiction, have probably experienced that as well. And it's really uncanny the way these things approach you. Like in that moment when they step into your mind, it's like, where did that come from? Yeah.
Can I just jump in there?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Mark.
Part of my recent research has been going into the sort of art and literature world. And there was a guy who's a multi-talented artist, poet, sculptor, writer called Sven Berlin. And he called that, what you're just describing, the magic shuttle. And basically, my whole podcast is based around these ideas of where does creativity come from, the muse and that sort of spark that just creates, the initial spark that creates something. Where does that come from, and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, that's why I found it fascinating going into that sort of world more, and sort of reading. I mean, I've read all the books by Sven Berlin, and he's a fantastic writer as well. But yeah, the magic shuttle is his way of putting it. That's it, really. That's yeah.
Allison, I think you had something you were trying to dive in.
Well, I just wanted to say I love talking about this and hearing you guys mostly talk about this intersection between fiction and reality. And I would be fascinated to hear if people want to divulge, some of their personal stories with the other. I'm just going to say that for many years, 13 years, I was an elementary school teacher at a Native American school. And anybody who's been a teacher knows that it's kind of a lifestyle where you're not able to do much else because the kids are so important, especially when they come from disadvantaged backgrounds or they're at risk. It can be very daunting, and that's what your mind is on for at least 95% of the time. You're living and breathing, trying to make things better for these kids. And so I, as part of this culture, even though I'm non-native, when they hire you at the school, they expect you to teach a lot of different cultural elements, which I was very happy to do. In college, I was drawn to Native studies, and that was like a minor for me with all the classes I took. And I think that's why they hired me, even though I'm non-native. But I had a lot of opportunities for spiritual interactions with other entities. And because I was so preoccupied with the reality of teaching these children, I didn't always stay up late to go to the special ceremony or get up early to go to the special ceremony. I went to a lot of ceremonies, but it's easy when you're just caught in the day-to-day grind, not to let these things in. And yet these things still bled in to my experience. And so many of our experiences we can just discount or explain away. But there was a time at the school where it was the school, the administration, who believed enough that there was a trickster among us that they did a special Saturday clearing of the school. Many people know about smudging with sage, one of the 4 medicines that we all had in our classrooms. But there are other ceremonies that use other herbs, burning of other herbs to clear. And there was a special ceremony, and I was around for that because I had my own interactions with the trickster. In fact, although most of my my experiences are very subjective and kind of joking towards me, I think it did maybe break my ankle. I had a strange ankle break. And that's what let me in on the fact that there was a trickster about. There were strange things leading up to the ankle break. And then when I came to school that Monday, and my mentor, one of our native language teachers, she saw me in our offices, and I was making copies. And she saw, my Franken boot that I was wearing on my foot where I broke my ankle. And she said, "Oh no, it got you too." And I'm like, "What?" And then she related that there was a trickster that was active in the school. And I must say that, like I said, most of my experiences were very subjective. I can't deny that there were weird things that happened that cannot be explained. And unfortunately, for others, it seemed to have resulted in a couple of deaths that happened at the school. For me, I just broke my ankle, or something precipitated me breaking my ankle. And then I had some slight kind of joking interactions with whatever it is. So it's amazing to me that, even when you are so wrapped up in the pragmatics of life, these things can still bleed in to your experience. So I would like to open that up and hear more from people if possible.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I realize I'm probably being really rude, but I have my other
I know you gotta bounce.
My other job calls. So Jim, Patrick, you are my stewards of my memory. So you can I give you full reign here. Thank you all for showing up, and I'll be in touch with all of you real soon about some of the things that are coming up with the continued release.
Cheers, Josh.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. So yeah, we've got a few more minutes to go. If anybody wants to throw anything else in.
Yeah, in the same vein that Allison's story, I can share a brief one that has painted pretty much the entirety of my trajectory from my teenage years and engaging with this stuff. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every summer, I would go spend like 8 weeks, and I would teach like different nature-related merit badge stuff, like insect study and reptile and amphibian study, things like that. So a couple years into doing this, myself and several other counselors got wrapped up into a series of paranormal events that are a little out of the scope of this discussion, too much to go into, but basically we were our own little losers club, and we're dealing with something like from the Stephen King novel It. And at one point we had determined that whatever this thing was that we were combating was underneath this rock quarry limestone field area north of the camp. You had to hike a bit to get out there. And one day we decided on the weekend, most people would go home, but our little group usually would stay there for the weekend because none of us had cars and we didn't want to drive. I lived like 3 hours away from there, so I didn't want to go all the way back home every weekend. So one weekend, myself and this group, we go out to this quarry area, and I experienced what later I would understand is like fairy leading or being led by fairies, because at one point we're walking through this quarry and at least 3 different people in the group thought they heard or saw something in the distance in like a patch of scrub or trees or something. And they all started running in opposite directions. And it was so bizarre to see because every one of them had this like glassy expression on their face and like they were being manipulated. It was bizarre. And I had to run after and like corral everyone and pull them back and say, no, like we have to stick together. Like, do not go off by yourself like this, like stay together. And some of them I had to like physically restrain to get them to come back to the group. It was one of the strangest things I've ever encountered because it was so out of the ordinary. It didn't feel natural at all. And it was one of the first encounters I had with this kind of thing where I realized that there was like an external reality to it, that it wasn't just fairy tales, that there was something else going on. And it was something that people have encountered since like time immemorial, basically.
Any last thoughts before we wrap it up? Well, I appreciate everybody. Oh, go ahead, Allison.
I'm sorry. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing that, Wren. And I just wondered if anybody else wanted to share some of their interactions with the other. I live for this stuff, so I can't pass up the opportunity to possibly hear some more stories. And Wren, like when you when those people, those kids that were with you saw it, did you see it? Did you see it too?
No, I didn't. I was the only one in the group who didn't seem to be affected by it. It sounds very corny to say it like that, but I didn't see what they were seeing. But,
and did they just how was it described to you afterward?
They just said that like they'd heard like noises, or they'd heard like something beckoning them from different directions. Each person heard a different thing. It was bizarre, but yeah, I didn't hear anything, and I'm glad that I was not affected by whatever, because it allowed me to keep people together and not let them just run off and by themselves.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, guys, I want to thank everybody for coming out this morning and helping to launch the book. Let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. So Wren, I'll let you go first. Website, social media, any stuff like that you want to help tell people how to get a hold of you?
Sure. You can find most of my contact info and some blog posts and stuff at my blog at liminalroom.com. I also have a Discord server. It's just a personal thing for people who want to talk about like magic and the paranormal. And there's an invite link on my blog for that. And yeah, feel free to email me or reach out to me if you want to talk.
Susan?
I have a website called Out of My Mind's Eye. It's at susandemeter.com, and it's got all my socials. And I like to hear from people, especially personal experiences. So feel free to reach out to me through there.
Patrick?
All right, unmute. So you can find me at patrickdugan.net. You can find links to the books at educateddragon.com. That's our publishing company that is putting out the book. My new book is Never Steal from Dragons, which is a cyberpunk heist book set in the world of Faerie. So it ties well into this. So it's got all the hidden people have left Earth to get away from the humans, and all sorts of fun happens.
Allison?
Yes, you can find me at my company website, AmericanGhostWalks.com. And there is an S at the end of that, AmericanGhostWalks.com. And I also have a YouTube channel, which highlights the contributions of women in the paranormal, parapsychology, and psychical research. And that's at youtube.com/paranormal women. So please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.
Mark?
Yes, I'm not on a lot of social media these days. I'm on Instagram under the Cuckoo Town podcast. And the Cuckoo Town podcast, I'm not pushing it, but basically all the material I put on there is sort of the sort of stuff that we would all, you would all enjoy. There's a mixture of high strangeness, interviews with people, but there's also a lot of sort of the more cultural side, the art and stuff, how it relates to high strangeness. And yeah, that's the best way of contacting me. If you have a listen, just browse through the episodes, you're bound to find something you like. Yeah, but other than that, just on Instagram, the Cuckoo Town podcast. I should just say the Cuckoo Town, there's two sources for that name. It might sound a bit crazy, but one of them was to do with a meeting we had with somebody, and we were having a conversation about high strangeness in a small town in Illinois. And a guy who wasn't into the stuff just kept interrupting, wanting to talk about something else. And we about 5 or 6 of us were talking about ghosts and spirit, all this sort of stuff. And he got so annoyed in the end that he was a bit autistic, I think, actually, he may have been. And he just basically turned on his heel and he said, "You're all cuckoo." So that we were looking for a name, and I just thought, yeah, perfect, because maybe we are all cuckoo, And but it also comes from the guy I talked about earlier, Sven Berlin, because he did an expose on the St. Ives artists community in the 50s that he lived amongst. And he did this book called The Dark Monarch, which is a fantastic book. It was banned on its release, but it's available now. And he referred to St. Ives in Cornwall, this artist colony, as Cuckoo Town. So it pulls in both of those elements for me. So it just seemed like the perfect name. So that's it. So yeah, Instagram and the Cuckoo Town podcast.
And Jack?
Yeah, I have a website. It's jack-hunter.webstarts.com. But it might be easy just to search for Dr. Jack Hunter. And I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find all sorts of interviews and things online.
And I've had the pleasure of being both a host again and a contributor for this one. And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, the speculative fiction academy.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we'll see everybody again soon.